Hey there. Good morning. It is, what is it? It is July 5th, which should have been, oh, it's looping. That's
Oops.
awesome. So that's, all right. Well, we
There you
got
go.
past that. So it's July 5th, 2024 here on the Dev Talk Show. Good morning, Rich. How are you doing?
Hey, good morning, Chris. How are you?
Good, good. I was just double checking, like everything seemed to be working. And then I said, I know that there's all this stuff that we set up to do this. And we
Yeah.
set a video now, and then there's the background music, but oh, I forgot to take off the loop setting on the background music. So it said, why don't I just start again?
There you go.
So here we
I
are on
think
the Dev Talk Show, everybody. Go ahead.
yeah, no, it's kind of funny. Chris and I are both kind of not this isn't a work day for us. We're just kind of
Yeah.
both on holiday. We both had some time this morning and we thought, hey, let's do a show because
Yeah.
people seem interested in this one.
Yeah. There's even more layers to it than I realized. Like we have some past shows which you may have gone back in the archive and watched, or maybe you were here with us. And like I said, our archive's always available on YouTube at youtube.com/TheDevTalkShow. And what we were trying to do at the very beginning was say, okay, when you create a Blazor project with that individual account setting for authentication, you get a lot of code dropped on you. And what is it all? And after we did some time exploring into what it was, it's setting up a user login with an email password, traditional email password, storing it in your database using Entity Framework. And then it's also allowing you to add more information for external login providers, whether that's Entra ID or Google or any of the other ones that are directly in the documentation. And then there's plenty more that are not directly in the Learn docs, but are available through third-party repos and repositories on GitHub and stuff, and NuGet packages. That it's a lot of stuff. And how do you use it all? And what if you're trying to add this to an app from scratch and maybe you don't want all of it? So we've been going down that path, and we did that server-side rendered with Blazor Web Apps that are purely server-side rendered. And I think that went pretty well, especially because you get HTTP context in a server-side rendered component. So that made it easy to use all of the same extension methods that you might have already known from previous ASP.NET frameworks and applications and platforms. But once you go to WebAssembly and have client components, it gets a little interesting. So that's kind of what we worked on last time, I think. And we got it working. We were able to sign in, but what's going to be great, I think, to start this show off is we found that the user signed in, and then like just as we're sitting there watching, it seemed to lose the sign in, which I attributed to, I attributed that to pre-rendering, Blazor's pre-rendering. But that's not the answer. I mean, that's part of the answer, but it's not the solution. It just tells us like the server-side rendered, the component must have rendered server-side, picked up who we were, and then we switched over to Blazor WebAssembly, and it, for whatever reason, we lost it. And I actually do know what the bug is there. But we'll catch up on all of that. We'll get the repo updated. There is a Blazor auth from scratch repository that will get updated. And then we'll see how far we get on external logins.
Yeah. Sounds fun. Awesome.
So before we start, I would like to show everybody, I think there was a very interesting community stand-up last week. I think the community stand-ups are always good. But this one in particular, I thought was interesting because there is a feature, there is a new cache. I don't know if I want to call it a pattern or an interface in ASP.NET called the hybrid cache. So if you've done web caching in your app, you may be familiar with distributed cache, which was added at some point. I don't know where in the timeline. But distributed cache, the idea is each of these caching abstractions is trying to set you up to be able to create kind of your layered cache pattern where a request comes in And the typical pattern in all web development is you want to see if you have the value already in memory, and maybe you have a local cache that you're using. And ASP.NET has in-memory cache. But then if you have a cache miss there, you might want to go out to a secondary cache, like perhaps a Redis cache, a really high performance cache that's maybe held close to your web server, to get answers very quickly. And then if you have a cache miss there, you don't have the answer there, you're willing to go back to the database. But you want to persist that as you come back across, so that way the next call to the database, given whatever parameters you set for expiration of that cache, there's a new abstraction to do this. It's called hybrid cache. And on the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up, John Galloway had on Mark here, and he went through code and talked about the hybrid cache. And it's actually the new preferred method. I'm not going to tell you I'm an expert with it yet. It was the kind of thing that we had on our list of, hey, we should get to this one of these days. But it's great to see a whole episode on it here.
Oh, that's cool.
So let me paste this in so that folks that are watching live can see what we're talking about. Of course, I just pasted it without putting any context on it, so I probably should have said ASP.NET Community Stand-Up on hybrid cache. And we'll make sure we get this added. So if you're watching on YouTube in the future, this link will be in the show notes down below, so you can see that. So yeah, I thought that was neat. So I figured folks might be interested.
Definitely.
Now, where are we? Okay, I got to present. I'm going to share the whole screen here because we tend to go back and forth as we're coding here. So this happens to be my development machine, and I was just checking in on where are we exactly with the code. Let's catch people up on. Oh, that's interesting. Why? I want to catch people up a little bit on where that you can find this. So on github.com, we have the TheDevTalkShow. And the TheDevTalkShow has a repository called Blazor Auth from scratch. So I'm going to add this in there. Okay, so where are we with this? The last time we worked, we added this feature branch, adding WASM from scratch. And the reason it was called First Attempt is because we know there's a problem with it. But I've actually figured that problem out. So what I'm going to do before we get started is there were two things that I realized about that particular commit that didn't make me thrilled. Is I was also shuffling around the Blazor Auth from scratch repo so that we now have, instead of all the code being at the root, there's now a source folder and there's a server and then WebAssembly project. So we're separating out the two now. And in the middle of all that shuffling, what I did not realize is that the git ignore for the repo was sitting in the server folder. So now when I made this commit, I had moved it. So there is no git ignore that controls anything else. So this initial commit has all of the artifacts that you usually don't commit. It's got all the stuff from the bin and the obj and everything like that. So that was a mess. So I said, okay, well, let's add the git ignore. And now that we've done that, for one thing, that has not been pushed back up. So that should help out up on the GitHub repo. So now that I've done that, and I love how it's like, yay, we already know what's going on. Let's just check this here. And I'm just going to double check that I think that, okay, I'd like to believe that all of whatever was there before is now all gone. So that's good. And let's see. The other thing we'll do is at the end of this episode, we'll merge this back into main so that folks don't have to go to a different branch for it. So that's interesting, though. Oh, you know what? I just pushed that up, but I didn't stage any of it. I don't think I actually did anything. I may not have actually done anything. Because what is all this doing? This is removing all of the artifact files, I think. Yeah, okay, so let's see. I might even rebase this to get rid of a lot of this stuff. So okay, so that mess. Okay, so now at least we're up to date before we get started. Now, where were we? So where we were with this application was, let's see. I'm going to take this out if it lets me. What's going on here? Okay. Where we were with this application is folks who may or may not remember from last time. We, let's see. In order to do state in the WebAssembly components, one of the difficulties that you're always going to have is that authentication is I say it's inherently a server-side operation. I think that's a true statement because without a server to authenticate against, we're absolutely trusting the client to tell us who they are. And that's not how authentication works. Authentication is about asking some authority, which might be it could be anything. It could be your own system, your own application that goes to a database and uses a hashing strategy to save passwords and so on. Well, not save passwords, but save password hashes. And that your app is the authority in that case, but that app is still running server side. We can't trust the client to tell us, oh, I promise you, I'm Chris. It's no big deal, because Chris has admin rights and he can do whatever he wants in your app. So the trick is these authentication state providers, where in Blazor, when you have WebAssembly and you have the two projects, there are two of them. On the server side, we have the persisting server authentication state provider, which derives off of this server authentication state provider that's in the box, part of ASP.NET, but we derive off of it to add a little bit more implementation. And what this implementation is doing, without walking through all of it again, is what it's doing is it's saying, okay, if there's a logged in user, if someone is authenticated, then let's get claims out. Let's get their claims out that represent who they are, and let's store them as JSON in the persistent component state, in a persistent component state. Let's store that. And once we've done that, then over in the client, meaning that when a client rendered component, a WebAssembly rendered component runs, its authentication state provider is set as this persistent authentication state provider. It's a different one. And it's saying, okay, well, I got to find out who is logged in. So let me ask my authentication state provider. And what this does is it says, okay, can I pull from persistent state a user info object? And if I can, then let's use the claims that I find in it to rebuild a claims principal right now. Let's just build one. And then the rest of ASP.NET can go forth as if I received the claims principal from the server. We're sort of we're packaging up its state, serializing it, sending it across to the WebAssembly rendered component, unpacking it, and using that to make determinations. And this all seemed to be working.
All of that.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Because all of that information and security bits of it wind up happening outside of our client side, so none of that gets shared locally if anybody goes looking for it. And then we're basically letting the server do the work and send that down to the client to do the process and kind of rehydrate it.
Right. So,
and I don't know if the audio is coming through effectively enough. I seem to be having some network connection issues.
Yeah, I'm hearing you okay. So hopefully that means everyone else is hearing you okay as well. So,
cool.
this is the kind of the wrapping up our recap here. Our Blazor Auth from Scratch app does not have all of the code that comes with the individual auth template. Instead, we have our own login page. And I do expect these breakpoints are going to hit and get in the way a little bit. Our login page, we did a little bit of work so that this page is actually rendered server side. Everything else is a client component. We are, I don't want to use the word cheating, but just to kind of demonstrate to people that in order to sign in a user, if you're doing this yourself, you choose who to sign in. You set up the claims principal and you sign in that claims principal. Whether or not that claims principal has provided you with a username or password or a two-factor auth or whatever it is that satisfies you that person has logged in, that identity has logged in, that's up to you. That's your implementation code. And we're leaving that out for simplicity. So this is not production ready code, because all you have to do to log in this app is just put in any username and we just sign that username in. So when I click login, we end up in the persisting server authentication state provider. And as the comment says, this is a server-side authentication state provider, which means that if I am in the server program CS, there's two projects in a Blazor app. This is kind of considered the server project, and this is where client components live. But they both have program CS files. You can see that we are using that persisting server authentication state provider right here. We're telling it, when you need an authentication state provider, go to the one that we built. And what it's going to do now, well, let me just hit F10 so we get back to that line of code. What it's going to do now is it's going to look, is there a claims principal set? Now, there isn't, because we haven't signed anybody in yet. So that's just going to skip on by.
Mm-hmm.
When I click the login button, or maybe, is it already done it? Nope. It doesn't look like it has. When I click the login button, oh, that's probably because I took way too long to do this. So let's, I think the anti-forgery token timed out. Okay. Well, so it did all of it, which is fine. It was very quick about it. So I accidentally skipped over it. So on the server side, the hello page just simply pulled from the claims identity and said, well, I'm just going to get the name out of there. And so we're going to say hello to whatever the name is. But now that's being pre-rendered. That is server pre-rendering in Blazor. So now the breakpoint that we're stuck on, this is in the client project. And it even says here, this is a client-side authentication state provider. So what's happening now is the hello page is now trying to render in WebAssembly, and it's not going to have a logged in user. So it is checking with the persistent authentication state provider to say, okay, let's see if we can find the user info. And what's interesting about this is this line of code is going to I was expecting it to cut out of that. Okay, that's what I expected. I expected it to drop out. Let me just run this again and see if I can get it to walk through. If authentication state task is null, which it is not, then it tries to get out of authentication state. It tries to get a user object, and it says, well, is it authenticated? Yes. So that's all working. Is it authenticated? Yes. Let's get out this claim. And once we get out this claim, if that claim was not null, then oh, I'm sorry. I'm in the server side again. I got confused. So we're in the server side. We're persisting it. Then that's pre-rendering. So the client side is coming in. And here we are, and it says, let me try to take this out of the JSON, and it skips over here to this claims array, and it does pull the claim out. It's the exact same claim that we filed. boy, I really hope this isn't confusing, but this is the same claim that we filed. Let me get the claims array up. Come on. There we go. Claims array. Zoom in. That's the claim that we filed over in the server persistent state authentication, server authentication provider. But the problem is, it turns out this is the wrong claim. So what happens is we build the user principal correctly. That all happens.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why it seems to disappear is because I put the wrong claim. I put the name identifier claim. That was the mistake. Instead of putting the name claim. So the name, so now I'm trying to show the name, but I didn't put it into the persistent state provider. That was the mistake made on the last show. That was the bug.
Gotcha.
So while that might all have been a little confusing, what we're saying is what we did on the last show was correct in terms of persisting state. The state authentication provider in the server did properly wrap up claims. It wrapped up the claims I told it to wrap up, and it sent it, it put it in persistent state so that way, when a client component unwraps it, it unwraps it and maps those claims to a new persistent principal and claims principal. It's doing that right here. It's saying, well, let's map the claims, and then let's create a new claims principal, and let's create an authentication state. And now that we've done that, the WebAssembly side has some identity that it can attach to. The mistake that I made is, see, this claim type is name identifier. And name identifier has a default scope that ends in name identifier. You can see that in the tooltip if I zoom in. But if we go back to our original provider, I stored this in a different claim type. I stored this in a claim type called user name, not username, not name identifier. It's a different claim.
Okay. And is that exposed up there on the server side as well?
So what's happening is that when the user is logged in, so let me just create it here. I just want a breakpoint here, and we'll run this again.
Okay.
And it says you're not signed in. And because we're not signed in, this code is never going to trip here that says, is there a principal identity that's authenticated? That's never going to trip. The client side is trying to check right now, and it's going to give up and say, nope, nobody put in the persistent state, nobody put a user info object, so I'm just going to return. I don't need to, we're not signed in. Everything works as we expect. But if I go to the login page and sign in, then what happens? Did I not click the button? I did click the button. You know what it is that it signs in silently. We don't have a redirect going on like we have on the client side. So this is the server side's persistent state provider, server authentication state provider, that is saying, look, someone is signed in. So let's get out of their claims identity. Let's get the username claim type. And here's where if I zoom in here, you can barely see it because it started to fade out. But I'm hoping that when I zoom in this way, we can still see it. The claim that is being stored ends in -name, not name identifier. I picked the wrong claim on the client side when I was pulling out claims. To make it a little simpler, there's all kinds of claims that you can store here. One of them could be your age. Let's say we had a custom claim that represented your age. Just to make there's a difference between your username claim and your name identifier claim. When we think about Entra ID or we think about Google external auth, when you as the app are asking the Google external auth provider, hey, can you give me the identity for this user? It gives you the name. It says Rich Ross, but it also gives you a ID that is distinct to you through all of Google's world.
Okay.
It's not a GUID, but it's like a GUID. And so that's the
Okay.
name identifier. And the mistake I made is I imagine that I packed the name into this state object that is being serialized for client components to use. But when I unpacked it, I said, the only thing in the suitcase is the name, but I asked for the identifier. Well, it's not there.
Gotcha. Right.
So the client side says like, well, there's nothing here. So let's just say hello, nothing, because you didn't send that across. That was the subtle bug. And so we don't have to do anything on the server side packing. The server side packing was fine. It is on the client side unpacking, where instead of name identifier, what I should have really done here, we can get a little help from IntelliSense, is if I hit dot, these are all of the defined claims that are just defined in the claim type struct. Instead of name identifier, I wanted name. And what we're doing is we're saying, let's set that name to user info's user ID, which may be, let me go to user info real quick. Where's our user info class? Okay, we only have a user ID in here. It's possible that, that what I really want to do after we see this work is make this a little bit better, like put name in, and then we can separate user ID and name. But right at this moment, I think we all just want to see it work. So now that I've set this, let's go back to the home page and ask, what is the home page doing? The home page is looking at the context user identity's name. I don't know what code in here. Maybe it takes user ID. I don't know. We could figure that stuff out, though. We have the source code. So this time through, we're not signed in. Go to login. Certainly, when I click login, I think it does it super fast. Then when I go to home, this is pre-rendered. That is pre-rendered code, but here comes the client-side rendering. WASM is compiling, and it is calling the persistent authentication state provider, and it's dropping down and creating the claim. And when we drop out of there, even now the client component, which I think what's going to happen here is it's going to run through it again. But as you can see, these debugger operations take a little while, and I'm not 100% sure if it's WASM decompiling. I really don't know. But I've noticed that this takes some time, and that I'll definitely want to remove the breakpoints. This usually doesn't take this long. But Visual Studio is serious thinking about it here. Well, this usually didn't take me this long. I like how it says a debugger operation is taking a long time too, but we didn't get the rest of the message. I'm going to cancel that.
That's taking some time to...
There we go. Go ahead.
Hello to Waleed. Thank you for joining us. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, great. Awesome.
Hi, Waleed. We had Waleed on here before. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was the subtle issue. When I can get out of the debugger here, I'm going to turn off some of these breakpoints so that we should not have to. That's interesting, though. I always wonder why. It seems like there's something that goes on when we're streaming, but it doesn't. I partially feel like why. I understand that streaming is a CPU intensive activity. Well, CPU and GPU, maybe more GPU, but I'm a little surprised as to. I wonder if it's CPU intensive because of StreamYard. Now that I think about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's close all that. So now, like, I said a lot of stuff there, but the real trick was pulling the correct claim type out, and then storing it as user ID. I'll be curious how this affects us when we connect to something like an Entra ID. Will the user info and user ID be a little more distinct than what we set on our own? And how is that going to affect this? I don't know. So, So then the trick is, well, we're going to want to get set up with Entra ID. So doing that is a little bit of setup. I think we're going to need some NuGet packages. And I'm just finding out what those are.
Okay.
But I think that's the next best step.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what people want to see as well, based on some comments and things. So
yeah, absolutely. So let me double check some things real quick. For example, I'm going to switch us to this mode real quick because I want to see if I have available my client secrets. And we'll talk through what those are. Yes, I do have them. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I have them off screen. And what else are we going to need? I think the Azure portal is helpful here too.
Sure.
So let me get that going and perhaps turn on Azure Mask. We'll see. Oh, it is on. Okay. Let me get the Entra ID section up. And I believe what I want is app registrations. And maybe it is enterprise applications. Oh, yeah, here it is. Entra ID. I just want to double check that I have the correct one. No. That surprised me a little bit. Okay, I found it. Okay, so let's switch back to our screen here. Here we go. All right. So what is the use case here? The use case here is, and I think this is a use case a lot of us are going to run into at work, which is why we pursued it, is at work you might be using Entra ID and you might be saying, we want to build an application that our users at work can log into. And you can follow the steps in the Learn documentation for adding Microsoft accounts, except that documentation has a little bit of a wrinkle to it. It opens the door to personal Microsoft accounts as well as your Entra ID tenant. That's not like horrible, but what if you say your use case is I only want the single Entra ID tenant to be, that's the only thing that I want used. That's the only thing that I want anyone to be able to log into. So you have to create an application. You have to create an app registration. And this is the sample that we've created. And I'm using a tool called Azure Mask that masks the app ID and masks the name. The app ID is the client ID. So you're going to need this. You're going to need what it says here in application ID. You just need to save that out somewhere. We are treating that as a secret. I'm not sure. I'd say it's one of those things that's kind of sensitive, but maybe not. I don't know if it's the end of the world. But I'm going to treat it as sensitive anyways.
Yeah, I would say in general, anything you're doing that provides authentication into your environment or some kind of access to your environment, you want to keep as hidden as possible. So
yeah,
not share more than is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, this is halfway to being able to impersonate me and use my Entra ID resource. You need the ID. You also need a secret. So if I just expose the ID, that's not enough. But so how do you provision secrets? Let's see. Do you do that? I'm trying to remember now. If you do that here, it's not in conditional access. See, that's funny that now that I'm forgetting where this is. Is it?
Yeah. So this is an enterprise app versus an app reg, right?
Right.
An
So I need to go. Right. I think what you were about to tell me is I need to go to app registrations, right?
Yep.
But what's odd is, here we go. So for, you know what it is? I think the reason why I get confused is because my personal user must not own the application. I have to switch to all applications to find it.
Huh.
I'm not 100% sure why that is. It could have been a simple mistake on my part. So when I click here, there's, well, the client ID got exposed there, but that's okay. If I go to secrets, this is the secret that it's masked. And, well, this value is masked. This, if I could create another client secret here, I could say new client secret. I can create it. And in fact, I'm not going to finish that off, but what'll happen is you get one opportunity to copy it out of the portal. And then once you copy it out of the portal, you can't come back and view it anymore. So it's masking it by only showing the first couple characters. But you need this. Once you have the client ID and the client secret, now these are the two secrets that you need in your application in order for your app to be able to come in here and say, hey, I am allowed to access this app registration. And it essentially allows your API to authenticate to Azure to say it is okay for me to authenticate users. It's a, yeah. There's one more thing
giving
that you
that permission
need,
down to the app itself.
Yep. There is one more thing that you need, and it is here. It is it's in endpoints. So in your app registration, there is an endpoints button. You need the OAuth 2 authorization endpoint and the OAuth 2 token endpoint. You need to copy these out as well. That's not something that is clearly discussed in the documentation. It is discussed, but it's not, I don't think it's front and center enough that I like when I did this the first time, I was like, why isn't it working? And I think we did that live. Why isn't it working? Why isn't it working? So,
right.
So now that I've said all that, let's see if we can get external auth working here relatively quickly. Where is my WASM project? That's this project. Okay. And then what we're going to need, I know we're going to need at least one NuGet package that I can think of. And this package is going to be on the server side. So let's add, I don't think I want to do it there, do I? Yeah, I can manage NuGet packages here. I just, for whatever reason, I got lost on another menu. And I want to browse. And I think I can just say Microsoft account. Yeah, this is it. This is ASP.NET Core middleware that enables an application to support the Microsoft account authentication workflow. So I'm going to go ahead and install that. Okay. I think that's all we need, but we're going to find out. There is some, go ahead. You're going to ask a question.
Well, I guess just, it kind of makes sense, right? All of the authentication is happening on the server side. So whatever backend service we're saying, here's some information about a user, can you authenticate them, happens out in that world. And the client side really just wants to know, well, is this person authenticated and what claims have you said they can have access to?
Right.
Really,
no,
the client really doesn't care then what you get it.
Yep, that's right. So this is our login page on the server side. All it has is a form, an edit form that lets you put in your username. We are going to add to this, and we're going to say Microsoft login. Because to log in with Microsoft, you don't provide any other information really, other than usually it's a button to click. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a form. Okay. So let's go over what this form does. We're saying you can log in with your Microsoft account. We are going to post to another endpoint that we haven't created yet. but that endpoint will be responsible to perform the login with the information that you've given. So what information does this perform login need? Well, one of the things that we're going to see the external login provider asks for is what is the return URL? What should we redirect back to? And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a secret form on our page. You can't even really see it because it has a hidden input type. We're going to put into the hidden input type a return URL of our current location. There's little red squigglies here because we're not injecting the navigation manager yet. The navigation manager is something built into ASP.NET Core. And the reason I know that is because of this namespace. Provides an abstraction for querying. Let's bring it back. And managing URI navigation. So that's helpful. But we're not injecting it into this component. So let's do that, which in Blazor we can do. We get dependency injection in Blazor just by simply saying what is it we want to inject and then giving it an instance name. So the instance in our class is now navigation manager. If you find it confusing for the instance name to be the same as the class name, you are free to do something like this. You're free to say nav manager, whatever just makes you understand that this is an instance variable, not a class name. And then you'd have to come down here and change the name there so that way you're saying, okay, with this navigation manager instance, let's get the URI out. And that's totally a comfort thing, whether you like that or not. That's a personal preference, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what else is going on here? Well, because we're doing a form, there's going to be an anti-forgery token. And notice that I'm not using edit form here. That's a choice that we made deliberately. I think we could redo this code and use edit form. And I don't have a problem with edit form. I was being kind of stubborn when we first started this, is how little Blazor can we use? Just so that we can learn, like, what are you allowed to use that's standard HTML forms, and then what can't you do? Well, so a little stubborn, I guess I would say. So now this is all the code that we need to start the login process, but the login process isn't actually going to work because when we post this form, it's posting to nowhere. So
okay,
we got to do a little bit of work there. So let's we're going to do some this is essentially some cutting and pasting from what we did on the server project, which I think provides an interesting opportunity later to talk about, like, is there a NuGet package we'd want to create or a shared library that might, keep all this stuff together? And I don't know if I have the answer to that yet. So what is perform Microsoft login? This isn't going to be another page. This is just going to be some code that runs on the server that performs the challenge with the external provider, with Microsoft. So I don't need a Blazor component here. I want to stress that I'm pretty sure that you could write a Blazor component. I think you could write one that accepts this, that reads out from the form, reads out from the post body, basically reads out the information you need and does the call. But I always kind of like the idea of using a minimal API, one that's local right here in this web service. And it just calls and it just does its thing real quick and compact and kind of easy to understand. That's what we did last time.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense because, in essence, you're calling some API on this. It doesn't need to have any kind of UI or any kind of interaction. It could just be a bit of code that needs to authenticate. It
doesn't need the whole stack, the whole server, the client-side stack. So we're going to add a class. And again, if you have followed along with this, you're going to see that we are literally cutting and pasting from the server-side version of this project. We're going to create a class that maps multiple minimal APIs, but we're going to create it with an extension method so that we can go to Program CS and have a one-stop shop to just map all the endpoints that we're going to need eventually. So in order to do that, we are going to, this is going to be an extension method. So that means I need to change this. I don't need it to be publicly visible to the whole world. It can be internal to this assembly. So we can use the internal keyword. And then I even like how Copilot takes a pretty good guess here about what we're doing. Not bad, not bad. Not what we're doing, but not bad. What we'll do is we will create this method here. We're going to create a map identity endpoints method, and it will return an iEndpoint convention builder, which is something minimal APIs use to allow us to do this, essentially, to create extension methods. And that's really, in my opinion, what this is for. So we can use the builder pattern out in program CS, and everything is great. The only problem with this is we're not returning any values. If endpoints was null, let's just get out of here. But let's also declare that all of these endpoints are in an account group. And now that we've done that, let us go ahead and map a method that you post to, which is what the form's doing. It wants to post, and it wants to post to a method called perform Microsoft login. We established that a little bit earlier. So what does this method do? Well, we inject HTTP context, and we also say get from the form, let's get out the return URL that was passed in. Once we have those, let's set up the provider. And this is a standard way to set up providers in ASP.NET, where you have to provide a provider string. So we just very simply just provide it just right here in code, and with a little bit of a message that says, hey, you could write a very generic external auth provider, but let's just keep it simple right now, so it's very obvious what's happening. If there's somebody signed in, let's sign them out, just in case. We have to pass a authentication property structure, and that structure can contain all kinds of values, but the only one we care about this morning is the redirect URI, so that we can tell the external provider where to redirect back to. That was set in the form. Basically, you said, come back right here. And the only method we have to call after that is a method called challenge. This method knows how to challenge an external provider, which is a very standard operation. It knows how to do it. And then when it is done, it will return a challenge HTTP result that ASP.NET Core knows what to do with, in terms of whether it should log the person in or not. So you get all that functionality just in line 27 right there. And that can be a little intimidating. Like, that does the rest. But I guess that's the point of it too, right? Is that we get to stand on the shoulders of the library builder and ASP.NET's identity system, and we don't have to worry too much about it. Now, there's still some things we're complaining about here. Like, I think I need one more of these. Okay. It looks like we automatically got some usings added that pretty much get us what we need. So I think we have, except that I don't know that this is the namespace that I want. I'm wondering if, we'll see. We'll see how this namespace may not matter.
Okay.
For some reason in our other implementation, we are using the namespace Microsoft ASP.NET Core routing. I'm not sure if that was maybe an oversight on our parts or not, and that maybe we don't want that, but we can look into that another time. I think for now we have the identity endpoint extension that we need, but we still have to set it up in program CS. So, and here's where this is to get interesting, I think. What do we have to do here? So we currently have an add authentication method, and we are saying that our default auth scheme is called TDTS cookie, our default scheme. It's just a string, and it's a string that we just keep using over and over so that everything falls within one scheme and therefore one cookie. So we need to add the cookie, but now we're going to go one more. We're going to add Microsoft account. This extension method was provided to us by the NuGet package we added a few minutes ago. Without that package, this doesn't exist. We can use the options pattern to set up this provider. And I've pretty much got that set, except that we aren't putting anything in here. And we need to add 4 pieces of information in order for a Microsoft account with a single tenant Entra ID to function. You need these 4 bits. You need a client ID and a client secret, which we talked about pretty extensively earlier. But if you want it to authenticate users in your Entra ID tenant, you're going to need to also provide the token endpoint and authorization endpoint.
Okay.
And for safety's sake, we store these in configuration. But we don't just store them in app settings JSON, which might get committed to source control. We don't want to do that. Instead, we will use the secrets.json feature of ASP.NET, which I'm just setting up off screen real quick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to X out all the secrets so that we can actually look at what the structure of this file looks like without me worrying about anything. Whoops. And then this right here happens to be the client. I think it's actually the tenant ID is what it really is. And this, I believe, is also the tenant ID. So perfect. So I should be able to copy this and bring this in on our screen. So we could, I mean, we're not going to do this, but just to show you, I could go right here into app settings JSON and I can add this. I wouldn't do it this way. I would do it like this. We could add this here. And this maps, I'm showing the Google one as well, even though we're not doing Google right now. I can map the Microsoft Authentication client ID, client secret, token endpoint, auth endpoint, and we can see it's being picked up here. But we don't want this in our app settings because this is going to get committed to source control. So we don't want that. So we will use a feature built into Visual Studio, but also built into .NET itself. This is not a Visual Studio only thing. But if I say manage user secrets, which I don't think we've done any user secrets in this app yet, like at all, but I just want to double check.
Yep.
So I'm positive about this.
And you're checking because you're looking at the projects file, right? See if that's...
Yes. Okay. So I right-clicked and said manage user secrets, and I didn't want any current secrets to pop up on the screen. Hello, everyone.
Yeah.
So instead, when you say manage user secrets in Visual Studio, or if you use the secrets stuff from the .NET command line, you get a file that's located very far away from your source. And I'm going to paste this in just so everyone can see. This is not actually how it's going to end up. But this is the idea. Come here, paste this in. This is a file that's just kept locally on my machine, which does mean that every developer on your team would have to build this. But I just think it's a good habit to get into to get this stuff out of your app settings files. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm going to now take this off screen and let's go ahead and switch back to just the two of us and get this updated very quickly. Hopefully it'll be quick anyways. Should be quick. With all of the real values. Save it and close it. And then I'll close it even on the other screen here, just in case. I don't think anything would happen there, but all right, that's our app settings file. That is not the secrets JSON file. So that stuff is now stored away. I don't need to save this. We get these values out. Okay, so that's one step, but it's not the whole thing. There's another interesting piece here that we have not been, at least I don't think, oh no, we do have. We have add authorization here, okay. We are saying that the Microsoft account, okay, that's all set up. Is there anything else left? Oh yeah, that's right. We created these identity endpoints, but we have not mapped them yet.
Okay.
Remember that extension method that I made that would map in a minimal API.
Yes.
Okay. There that is. And again, it's not complaining about the namespacing. So I'm not sure why the other one, it seems weird to me that there's code that we declared would be in the Microsoft namespace. That might have been a mistake. Now, part of me is wondering if this is really enough to do the job. I suppose we can run it. We may just find out. But let's see. Oh, actually, no, yeah, I think we put a form into the login page. It's not its own component yet. We've done that in later episodes, right? We make this stuff into their own components. I wonder, I think this is good. Why don't I set a breakpoint in our extensions and we will watch it try to get in here. So let me go to login as soon as I can get. And you can log in with your Microsoft account. Okay. I don't know that I can log in though. In fact, I think one of the issues that we have here is it gets a little funky if I don't open this in a private window. Because it tries to use my personal account, and which is not in the tenant.
Makes sense.
So now what that means though is, here, let me, I have credentials for this user, and now I got to remember where they are. Okay, good. I have it. I did have it ready to go. I was thinking, like, is that something I forgot to have prepped? So we have some pretend users in our in this tenant, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say login with Microsoft, and so it did fire and hit our minimal API here. So it's trying to do the challenge. I mean, we haven't done the challenge yet, but we're getting started on it.
Right.
So that did work the way we expected, which is good. I'm glad. That almost felt, copying that code from before, I said, like, is that all just going to do what we want? So did I get another page? Is it thinking? Okay. This is actually now the Microsoft world is saying, well, you don't have a Microsoft user logged in. Let's see if we can get them logged in. We can tell because we've been redirected. So this is our third-party auth provider helping us. If we were in Google, we'd get the same kind of experience, except it would be Google focused. So I have a user here called example user at our tenant. They have a password that I hope hasn't changed. Let's see what it says. Okay, nice. Cool. I think we have dealt with this before, where this might be a setting in our org, but I think it lets us skip this, doesn't it? Oh gosh. How did we skip this before?
Usually you get so many days to skip that, and it may not.
Well, now I wonder if we're past that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I don't really want to set up the authenticator, but I guess it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if we did. If I did, it wouldn't be the worst thing. It's just another app authentication in my app, right?
Yeah, you may want to take the QR code off the screen.
Oh, yeah, that's a good call. So instead, let's just not.
Let's go back. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder, is it going to be a different QR code?
Most likely, yeah.
Okay. And oh man, I wonder if there's a way to disable it in the Entra ID. What do you think is the easier path? To just go through with this off screen?
It's probably easier just to go through it off screen, because if it's somewhere, yeah, we'd have to find the setting and all that.
Okay. Well, I'm going to do the login process again.
Okay.
And, oh, well.
Making you re-authenticate?
No, it's actually, it blew up because it thinks that there was a Microsoft account that was half logged in. So let me create a new in private window again and start that process over. Sorry about the off-screen part here.
That's okay. Yeah, I think this is kind of important, though. It's good practice for your tenants to have two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication associated with each of those accounts. So yes, it's a little bit of extra steps that you need to go through to make sure when you first log in, you get all that signed up, but it is good protection moving forward. So cool.
Yeah, it's just asking me to authenticate again, username and password. Okay, and now action required. You're right that we probably built this and then, you know, that time has expired on us. So, okay, I want a work or school account according to this. And the app is saying I can scan a QR code, and it's showing the QR code.
Cool.
Okay.
And taking the app on your mobile device and using that to scan the code.
Yeah, that did it. The only question now is I'm not 100% sure where it went.
Probably the bottom of that list.
Oh, yep, there it is. You're right. So now I have to put in the, yes, it's sending me a notification. I'm completing that. And it says notification approved. Okay, so after all that, we were redirected, and then I can bring us back up now, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, there you go.
We were redirected back to our app. And when I click home, because remember, we're not doing redirection in this the way I'd kind of like to. When somebody signed in, I would like to get sent back to the homepage, which we've done that before. Yeah. And look at that. It knows who we are. It knows that's the name of the test user. So that worked.
That's pretty cool.
Seemed a little hand wavy because we didn't get to watch it all, but let's open a new in private window and try this process again.
Yeah. But I mean, to be fair, the hand wavy part is the stuff that happens outside of your application. It's happening at whatever your identity provider is. All the stuff we showed is how to make sure your application can go make that call and take care of the data when it comes back.
Right. Nope, that's exactly right. So what I'm hoping to do here is I'm hoping that if I create yet another in private window, well, no, it seems like that carries over in a second in private window.
Well, because the cookie's on your machine, right?
Well, I thought maybe creating another in private is another in private window, or do I want a different option? Do I want to say not a new in private window? It would be like, I guess I could use like a whole other browser, right?
Yeah, you could try that. I'm not sure if that would still find the cookie. Well, it probably shouldn't.
I don't think it shouldn't. No, those are browser dependent, fortunately. So here we are. This happens to be Brave, and I'm going to say login with Microsoft, and our app still pauses here. And oh, that's interesting. Clearly, I've used Brave before for this. So it must have been for the same reason as I was probably trying to say, I need a browser that I know I haven't logged in with. And I'm not 100% sure. I think a QR code might pop up, or no, it's going to ask me to authenticate.
Yeah.
Right. It's going to ping my phone. Or is it just going to work? Okay. Maybe because I've authenticated recently on the phone, it didn't.
Depends on the rules, right?
Yeah. That will be interesting. If we can figure out where to look up those rules, that might be very valuable in a future show.
Yeah. Yeah, we can pull that together.
So what have we done? We have, in fact, let's see if Get Kraken will help us help us do a summary. We have, that's interesting. I still am getting, it still wants to, I don't know why it still wants to VS files. I think that's weird. I think the git ignore would remove those.
Mm.
No, see, look at all this. Why? I don't, that's odd. What have I done wrong here that, like, where's the git ignore file? It's in the base. Because I don't want to commit all that stuff. I was hoping, yeah, I was kind of hoping that this would just work, unless I can't understand why. Yeah, I can't understand why the git ignore file isn't removing that stuff. We'll have to look at that. I'll have to look at that later before I move this up. But what I was hoping to do was to use some of the diff features so that we could understand what we did. In the program CS file on the server side, we added Microsoft account, and we mapped the identity pinpoints using an extension method. If we want to know what that looked like, that was by creating this identity endpoint extensions class, where we created one minimal API. We just used the minimal APIs. And we added to our login page the ability to log in with Microsoft. We also had to add a package reference to Microsoft account, the Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication Microsoft account. And once we did all of that, the only really steps left, I don't think we actually did a whole lot on the server side at all, on the client side at all, except we fixed our bug from last time.
Yep.
Unpack the claim that we packed, basically.
Yeah.
So that was it. That's all we did. It really wasn't that much code. It might have seemed like a lot more explanation, but we now have external login support.
Yep. Yeah, that's once I mean, that's the cool part, right? Once you had that framework in place that lets your application authenticate using the appropriate points on the server and the appropriate points on the client and have them communicate with each other, now you can hook up to whatever identity provider you want, which is awesome.
Right. We're in a place now where it should start to seem obvious what to do next for the next provider. If you were following along on the server side, you can see that I'm kind of at this point where I'm just copying code, right? I didn't really blaze any new trails.
Right.
So that leads me to believing, I wonder if there's like a library that might be useful here. I don't know. Or I don't know. It's something that you would make into a library for like wide distribution, but it could be something your team would do, is put this shared code in a shared project so that your team has it. Because otherwise I feel like you're just sort of reinventing what's already out there, which is package by package, each external provider. Yep. This is like the last mile hookup, the last mile glue. The stuff that we're doing here is it's just that last little connection. It's not a lot.
No.
And we get what we're looking for. So
yeah. And then this way, if you do it the way you're describing, you have a common way of doing authentication against that identity provider, that any app, whether it's a WASM app client side or other applications, you're just calling an endpoint. So
yeah. Now I do have some cautionary. I say cautionary tale, but that would imply that like it's like a tale of woe from my past. I think it's just a warning.
Okay.
It would be very simple to create a Blazor web app that's server rendered and to do all the things we did in our server rendered project, working directly with HTTP context and having your components be smart enough to say, well, I can see that the person authenticated is an admin. So I'm going to go ahead and here in my Blazor component, I'm going to go ahead and update the database or do the admin thing, do the thing that this user has permission to do. That's only safe in a server rendered application because control of the HTTP context logged in user is all being done server side.
Yeah, sure.
Once you make the choice to build WebAssembly based components, you now have to think about that shipping of the user information across. While it works and it's the really the only thing that we can do. Don't forget that your user can spoof that anytime they want. They can basically insist to your application. This got to do is just, a little bit of disassembly of the .NET code, or maybe you were writing a single page app with JavaScript. You have the same problem.
Mm-hmm.
Is you are trusting that the server's telling you that Chris is logged in, and you trust that the server's telling you that Chris has these roles. So I can show UI that's related to that role. I might show the admin page, but I have to make sure that my components go back to the server and call APIs using a cookie that identifies that you're logged in, a server-based cookie, to get data, to write data, to make all of the application updates based on that user's role. You can't put this in your code behind section of the component. And when I say put this, I mean direct calls to the database, calls to APIs that will not authenticate that cookie. Because a lot of times a pattern that I think a lot of developers use is since we're used to building server apps, we have you call in on a form, maybe a form post to a server endpoint, and then the server just calls the database, but it calls it with super user permissions.
Right.
Because it's like, oh, well, you can't get in here unless you were an authenticated call. Now, I'm actually going to argue that that's not a great practice either. I'm not a big fan of that. Even in server apps, I like flowing the authentication.
Yeah.
But a lot of applications do it.
Yeah. Because think about it. All we've done here is authenticate the user. Yep. We haven't done anything that says, well, what are they allowed to do with the authorization side of it? And there are things that you could do in your app registration with app roles and things of that nature to say, well, once you've authenticated, these are the things that you've now been given access to go do. And I think that's that next step you got to make sure you check along the way, which is, yes. Yep.
So like and this is where it gets really interesting, writing client-side apps like this, is we could have a user profile page. And perhaps that user profile page calls an API to get your information, your address, your phone number, your birthday, all that stuff. I have to make sure that in the client app, I don't have the ability to call that profile API, hand it any user ID I want, and it says like, okay. Instead, I have to call that user profile API, pass along the very same server-side cookie that securely is stating who you are, so that even if you try to hack it and say, well, I'm going to call the API with a different user ID, what happens is the API says like, you know what? You're not Chris Gomez. So I have two choices here. I could return your information and just ignore that you tried to get someone else's, or I could just blow the thing up and say you're unauthorized. Those are choices you can make along with maybe some folks in your security and compliance type ownership, and your development leaders. You can make those decisions. But a lot of times when we watch people build apps, either in documentation, tutorials, and so on, and I'm kind of, little slap on the hand to all of us, because we all do it.
I'll do it.
We just throw the call to the database right in there because we're like, hey, look how easy it is, just entity framework, DB context, boom, off to the database. It's like, but what about the security of this call? So that's something we could dive into as we continue working on the client side, because we now have a forcing function. The fact that if it's made you nervous as you're watching this, that, well, wait a second, the client is just accepting whatever the server tells it. Like, that seems scary. Well, your security mitigation is that every call you make back into your APIs should be authenticating you server side again and again and again, and making sure, like, yes, you are the person that you say you are authorized for these roles. It's not just because the UI thought you were authorized for these roles. It's because you are authorized for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And when we say going back to the server and authentication again, everybody can, oftentimes you think, well, I don't want them to have to sign back in again. And that's not what we're saying.
Yeah.
Because often that authentication can happen silently as part of the flow of, what you're trying to do server side.
Yeah, because, and we've shown it on these shows before, is that when you're signed in with ASP.NET, a cookie comes down to your system. The ASP.NET cookie is we've shown it in the developer tools. It's there. If you if you delete that cookie, you're suddenly not signed in anymore.
Right.
But what's great is that cookie is being sent with every server call. So you can build a very robust client-side application that never goes back to the server and does everything that it can locally. But when it's time to either store some data, retrieve some data, make sure the user has permission for you to show them some UI. Well, if you absolutely have to make sure with the server, then that's usually an API call. And so the cookie, as long as you're going back to the same domain, which is why I kind of like this minimal API approach in your Blazor app, it sort of makes it like a backend for front end, and it's going to also receive the same cookie. Maybe that's what we have to do, is build some local minimal APIs and then take the user identity out of it so that we can show like, see, I still know it's you. And then that thing turns around and calls third-party APIs, right?
Yeah, goes down the chain there.
Interesting patterns there that we can look at. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. Well, there's certainly some work I have to do to get this pushed up to GitHub. I was hoping to do that live, but I'm confused as to why all those artifacts are back. So I got to figure that out. And then this will get up to GitHub. We'll put a link in the show notes. It's going to be on the main branch. We're now going to have your Blazor WebAssembly from scratch login with a WebAssembly based app, with a server based app. And we're probably at the point where we can start moving on to things like role-based security, policy-based security. We could probably start to head that direction.
Yeah. So some fun shows lined up to do that once we all get back after holiday. So
yeah. So hey, if you're watching in the U.S., hopefully you had a great Independence Day. And maybe a long weekend. I know some people turned this into a 4-day weekend. I think some people turned it into a 5-day weekend. So because we just happen to be on a Thursday this year. So, and no matter where you are in the world, thank you so much for watching. But it is a little past 9, so probably have to run to some morning meetings. And hopefully you all have a great weekend, and we'll see you all next time on the Dev Talk Show.